Welcome to this CommunityViz video tutorial. This tutorial is about using Scenario 360's Google Earth Exporter, which creates KMZ files that you can view in Google Earth, ArcGIS Explorer, or other viewers. The Google Earth Exporter is just one of 3 different ways you can make 3D scenes in CommunityViz. And what it does is it takes a 2D analysis like this one I've been working on and turns it into a 3D visualization like this one that's being displayed in Google Earth. In this tutorial, we'll learn how to make that happen. Let's start with a few concepts of how the Google Earth Exporter goes from 2D to 3D. Points on a map usually turn into models in a 3D scene. Buildings, trees, these have volume, you can fly around them. Lines on a map generally turn into lines in the 3D scene, maybe roads or trails. And polygons on the map either turn into ground cover like lawns or parking lots, or into extruded buildings, that is a footprint that's been pulled upwards. And the process of creating a 3D scene is essentially going through every layer in your analysis and telling the tool how you want that 2D to 3D transformation to occur. To do that, there's a wizard. You can find it on the Presentations toolbar, which looks like this, or from the Scenario 360 drop-down menu, Presentations, Google Earth Export Settings. Now, the way you use this wizard is you just work through the tabs from left to right. The first General tab, you specify where you want the eventual file to be put. It's going to be a KMZ file. In the next tab, you choose which of your scenarios you want to export. Let me show you what that looks like in Google Earth. In the My Places table of contents, you can see there's 2 groups, the Alternative A group and the Alternative B group. Those are the names of my scenarios. If I want to switch scenarios in Google Earth, I just turn off one and turn on the other. There's no particular limit of 2 scenarios. You can have as many scenarios as you like. The third tab here, Layers, is where most of the action happens. Here's a list of all the layers in my analysis, and to use this tab, I highlight a particular layer in the list and then make it settings over here on the right. Now, the settings available to me depend on the type of layer. Buildable area is a polygon layer. It's actually these colored polygons you can see in the background. And for that, I have 3 choices. I can export just the geometry, which will export those shapes into Google Earth. I can extrude those polygons into something taller, or I can use an image. Now, assuming I've chosen geometry, I can either use my existing symbology, like the colors and boundaries, or I can just specify a particular color if for some reason that's easier for me. Now, I don't have to set up every layer in my analysis if I don't want to. A check means it's going to be used. Lack of a check means it's simply not going to appear in the Google Earth scene, and that's fine. Buildings is a point layer, and naturally enough, it contains all the buildings in my analysis. For point layers, I have, again, 3 choices. The geometry, which would just put points out, an image of the symbols that I'm showing right now, or 3D models, and this is typically the most common. A 3D model is usually a SketchUp or KMZ file that you get from somewhere and you export to Google Earth. Where do you get it? Well, there's a whole library of them provided with CommunityViz in the 3D models folder. Or you can get your own for free from the web or by making them with SketchUp. Now, once you have a 3D model, you have a couple of choices. You can choose from a list, which we'll get to in a moment, or you can get the 3D model file from a field. Now, let me explain what that means. Here in the buildings layer, I'm going to open up the attribute table. These are attributes of the buildings layer, and there's many fields in them. In my case, I've populated a field called GE Models for Google Earth Models, and I've put in there the full path name of the particular KMZ models I want to use. Now, how do I decide how do these get here? I can do it manually, or I might use the Scenario 360 build-out wizard, or I might write a script, any number of options. The key is that these have to be text fields. So once I have them, I simply point to that field, see GE models, and the wizard is going to know which KMZ to use for each building in my analysis. Finally, I can choose how they should be oriented on the map, whether they should face north or northeast, etc. I can enter degrees manually, or I can use another field, which I happen to have here in my buildings layer, which points the buildings towards the nearest road. How did I figure out that? Well, I used a Scenario 360 function called AngleTo, which calculates that for me. You don't have to use Scenario 360 for that. You may have other methods, but that's a good, easy one. Back in the Google Earth scene, you can see I've represented buildings in several different ways here. One is with those 3D models of buildings, and they have textures and are more complex. I also have some simpler ones here that are just representational. We sometimes call those monopoly buildings. And over here I have some commercial buildings that are just showing massing. These are extruded polygons. So looking at those in the setup wizard, again, the complex buildings that I was using 3D models for, you already saw, I used specific models. For those monopoly buildings, what I did is I only had one model. I could have had 2 or 3, and I didn't have a field in my layer. I just pointed to a particular file, a KMZ file, somewhere on my computer. So the way I did that is I chose 3D models. I said select a random 3D model from a list, and then I populated this list. So now when the 3D scene is made, each building, each existing building in my analysis will get a random choice from this list. In this case, they all get the same. Again, the orient field. And then remember those commercial building footprints that were extruded? Well, those were polygons. I did extrude polygon. I used the layer symbology. And then I had to pick a height. Now, I didn't have a field here giving height, so I just typed a number, 20 meters. Google Earth works in meters, so these units always have to be in meters. If I'd had a field or an attribute in my layer, then I could have used that instead. A final example of layer types is lines. Here, for example, is streets. There's just 2 choices in this case. One is geometry, in which case you can pick the number of pixels wide each line will appear in Google Earth. Experiment with different settings on that, but be aware that the appearance will change as you zoom in and out on Google Earth. The other option is image, and that's a way to capture your current symbology. The next tab over is optional. If you've run timescope on your analysis, you can choose to export those layers with their timescope settings into Google Earth. All you have to do is check those boxes, and this automatically happens. There's a timeline in Google Earth that appears. This shows the date, and as you move the timeline, the buildings that are built or not according to your timescope analysis appear and disappear. And the final tab, again optional, is charts. If you have charts in your analysis, put a checkbox next to the ones you want to appear in the Google Earth scene. And that adds an additional item to your table of contents called charts. Now, the charts display here in the lower left. One thing to know is that they're overlaid on top of one another. So if you want to see some and not the other, you have to turn them on one at a time. Now, often with charts, it's nice to make them slightly transparent so that they don't get too much in the way of the scene. And by the way, that's a good tip for some other elements, particularly trees, look a little better in Google Earth when they're slightly transparent. So finally, when you're finished, you can click Export Now, and immediately that KMZ will get created and Google Earth will be opened on your computer. Or you can save your settings for later. Then as you're working with your analysis at any time, just click this button, the Export to Google Earth, and that does an immediate export so you can see your analysis at any time. That's an introduction to the Google Earth Exporter in Scenario 360 Community Viz. Don't forget there's also 2 other options for 3D that you might want to explore. Thank you for watching this Community Viz video tutorial. For more video tutorials and Community Viz resources, please visit the website.